The proceeding will start shortly.
Order, order. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Thursday, the 18th of May, 2023. Today we're looking at the Child Trust Funds. These were set up between 2002 and January 2011, and the government paid more than £2 billion into these funds for 6.3 million children born in that time, and they can access that when they turn 18. Most children receive £250 into their original account, though those from low-income families received an additional £250 from government, so £500 in total. Those child trust funds became slightly sort of legacy financial instruments after January 2011, so some people will have converted them or taken the money out, but many of them are not have not been accessed by the young people concerned, and they're reaching maturity from now over the next few years. So we're really keen to know how HMRC is now having to enliven itself to deal with this now what is a live policy issue, and make sure that those young people get the money that is in those accounts that they deserve to have. So I'd like to welcome our witnesses. Of course, from HMRC we have, as ever, Jim Harra, the first Permanent Secretary and Chief Executive. Welcome to you, Mr. Harra. And he's joined a first-time visitor to the Public Accounts Committee, Emily Antcliffe, who's the Director of Individuals Policy, which sounds quite interesting. We might want to explain what that means in a moment, Ms. Antcliffe. And then from the Share Foundation, we have Gavin, who's the chairman and founder, and has been playing a very big role in making sure that young people can access these accounts. And Anthony Walker, who's the director of operations there. So a warm welcome to you. Ms. Antcliffe, it might just be helpful before we go any further, just if you can explain what Director of Individuals Policy covers at HMRC.
Yes, so I'm responsible for HMRC's role in development of tax policy where it impacts on individuals. So I cover all of income tax policy and national insurance, as well as issues around savings and pensions, and also we have responsibility for delivery of student finance.
So kind of half the population or more. Okay.
Impacts on a large number of people.
Quite a lot of people. And Mr. Oldham, it might just be helpful for people who are following if you could explain, we know what you are, but if you, better in your own words, if you could explain what the Share Foundation is and what you're doing in terms of child trust funds.
Share Foundation is a registered charity formed in 2005, originally to put extra money into the child trust funds of young people in care during those first 5 years when the scheme was underway. When the government changed in 2010, there was drawing a line under the child trust fund and introducing the junior ISAs. We felt it was extremely important that young people in care should still continue to receive a starter capital account. And we campaigned with Barnardo's and Action for Children, and the junior ISA for young people in care was brought in as a result from that. We put ourselves forward for running the scheme along with various others in competition for tender, and we were accepted in 2012. That's when Anthony joined us at that point, and we've been running that scheme for the Department for Education ever since, the last 10 years, 11 years, and we've just had our contract extended for another 4 years now. When we work with 211 local authorities throughout the United Kingdom, and increasingly we found confusion happening because part of the young people's base was looked after by the Child Trust Fund with the official solicitor, and part of it with ourselves in the junior ISAs. And so we asked that the scheme should be brought together, and the Child Trust Funds for young people in care, for those without a person in a position of parental responsibility, which is the area where the official solicitor looked after, that was transferred to the Share Foundation's administration in 2017. But we do take a very close interest in the whole Child Trust Fund base. And so we run the whole of that scheme. It was following problems regarding the reconciliation of the official transfer, the transfer from the official solicitor, which are recorded in the NAO report. In fact, you can see there... We'll
get on to the NAO report in a minute, really.
We'll get on to the detail of that. But anyway, that's when we realised that there was a serious problem with child trust funds. And so we then brought in a purely voluntary exercise to help young people to find their child trust funds throughout the United Kingdom from whatever background.
Okay.
And we've been running that for the last 5 years. So sorry to take
No, but thank you, because I think because a lot of people, it's a very small window. We were just discussing which of our children might have qualified for this, and so it's a very small window, so a lot of people won't have come across your organisation or indeed child trust funds, so it's just helpful, I think, to have that on the record. Before we go any further, I need to just take declarations of interest from Ms Blake.
I am the chair of the APPG on special educational needs and disabilities, and also a vice chair on the ADHD APPG, which may or may not be relevant.
And just for clarity, I'm the only member of the committee who has a child who did get to have a child trust fund. I converted it to a junior ISA some years ago. So I no longer have a direct interest in this, but obviously a wider interest as a constituency MP and chair of this committee. Now moving on to child trust funds. I'm going to ask Mr Peter Grant MP to kick off. Mr Grant.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Harra, at the time of the NAO report, the most up-to-date information we had was that 145,000 young people who could have claimed their child trust funds hadn't. There was about £394 million lying unclaimed in those funds. Do you have an update for us as to where those figures are gone now?
No, so that was based on the last set of statistics that we published last July. The next annual statistics will be published this July, so in the meantime there's no other published information other than that. So that related to young people who became 18 between the 1st of September 2020 and the 5th of April 2021. There were, I think, about 370,000 of them, and as you say, at the 5th of April, 145,000 of them had not yet accessed their accounts.
Thank you. Mr. Oldham.
I wonder if I could just explain what our estimates are and how we work them. We keep population statistics on all 18 to 20-year-olds who would be eligible for child trust funds throughout the United Kingdom, and we keep regularly in touch with the Account Providers Trade Association, TISA, for their estimate of the unclaimed adult CTFs which are in the system. And the latest one I have on that is Easter of this year, when they estimated 42%. If that figure is correct, that means that there are now over 900,000 young people who have unclaimed adult CTFs. They're predominantly low income. We know that from research that we've done. Using the NAO figures for the average value of CTFs of £1,900, that means a value of over 1.7 billion, which has been unclaimed by young adults so far. Just to put that in context, on the Children in Need appeal on the night raised 35 million. It would take half a century, 50 years of Children in Need appeals to actually raise the same amount of money which is unclaimed by young people at the moment. That's what our estimate is across the UK. It is a really major issue, particularly at a time of a lot of cost pressures, cost of living pressures on these young people, and really denying them a proper start to adult life. So that's our estimate.
Chair,
Mr. Harra.
First of all, if I can just correct a figure, I said 370,000. I think it was 320,000 accounts matured during that period. Yes, I mean, there are obviously a variety of estimates. I mean, the Investing and Savings Alliance estimated that, which is in the NAO report, I mean, it's on page 9 at paragraph 12, around 27% of accounts remain unclaimed a year after maturity. But we will have, from an official statistics point of view, another year's worth of data published in about 2 months' time.
Yes, well, I think TISA does accept that in the oldest cohort, the oldest annual cohort, the rate has dropped down as low as 27%, but the average for 18 to 20-year-olds is 42%, according to the Trade Association, which is probably the most reliable estimate you'll get at the moment.
Well, I mean, rather than getting into a ping pong as to who's got the most up-to-date numbers, is it fair to say that there's a very large number of young people who have not claimed a huge amount of money that's owed to them, or that is legally theirs, and that nobody's quite sure how many or how much? Is that a fair summary of it?
I think we will have good data, which, as I say, we publish annually, on how many accounts have matured, and of those, how many have been accessed and how many have not, and what the value is in those accounts. I think there's a bit more information required to understand what the behaviours are. So where accounts have not been accessed, is that because the account holder is unaware they have a CTF, or they are aware they must have one but they don't know where it is, or they know where it is but actually they've decided not to access it at this point. And I think because it is open to them just to leave their funds as a tax-free account is invested. So I think over time, as more accounts mature and we gain more data, we'll need to get deeper and deeper into those reasons.
Mr. Oldham, from your experience, why are the young people not claiming this money? Is it simply that they don't know that the money is there and nobody quite knows where the young person is to tell them?
We believe that's absolutely the situation. I have also, up until a couple of years ago, been responsible for a retail investment company called the Share Centre. And no longer that now. It's now been merged into Interactive Investor and sold to Aberdeen. But actually, before that happened, I did a detailed analysis of the revenue allocated accounts, which were administered by the Share Centre, which they kindly, and my colleagues allowed me to do, and pass on those records onto the Share Foundation, and that's recorded in the NAO report. So you can see the figures within there. What we discovered is that the main problem is in the revenue allocated, the HMRC allocated accounts. And there were really two aspects of those. One was the addressee gone away number, and the other was the never registered with the family number. These accounts were set up after 1 year after birth because the family hadn't done anything about it. The HMRC would, of course, written to the family to tell them about the account having been opened, but I don't believe there was that much communication following or follow-up to make sure that it had been received. And we discovered that over 85% of the revenue allocated account base was either never registered or addressee gone away. And we also identified the much higher proportion, I think the NAO report records it as 51%, which are low-income families from families in receipt of child tax credit where the extra money was paid in. So we're talking about really a problem which affects those who are the most disadvantaged and where they wouldn't have understood anything about the accounts in the first place. And they're just totally unaware of it. And this is why we need to communicate so much at this stage.
Isn't that pretty much the precise target group of young people that the accounts were set up for in the first place?
Isn't that
the kind of young people you've described from low-income families who maybe don't have a lot of dealings with banks, wasn't it one of the key objects of the whole scheme to encourage those young people and their families to get into the habit of saving? Because presumably young people growing up in a well-off family who've got bank accounts of their own, the chances are that young person is going to get into banking quite quickly. So you seem to be saying that the very people for whom the scheme was particularly targeted are exactly the same people that it's made no difference to because they don't know the money's there.
Yes, I think that's absolutely the issue. I think that the government which introduced it had every correct motive about providing a starter capital account and some financial awareness to help build their understanding. But the communication wasn't there throughout the scheme. And I have to say that the point that we've reached at the moment is a particularly difficult one. I mean, I'm aware of a question which was placed by John Ashworth on, I think it was...
Ashworth MP, just to... Yeah.
Yeah, that's right, MP. And he asked the Chancellor of the Exchequer in relation to the NAO report, for what reason the government has not planned to commission additional data collection to enable an evaluation of the Child Trust Fund scheme. There's quite a lengthy response to that, but the really illuminating paragraph from that response says, the scheme has been closed to new entrants for over 12 years. In this time, HMRC has been focusing resources on evaluating and improving existing schemes. We will continue to keep the need to evaluate old schemes under review. Now, to actually describe this as an old scheme is a bit like a farmer planting his crop in the autumn of, let's say, last year, and you reach the harvest time this summer, and he says, it's an old thing now, I planted it last year, I'm not interested in that anymore. I'm going to do other things now. So just at the time when we need to harvest this crop, basically, we have so many young people who are not aware of it. So yes, what you're saying is absolutely the case, but it's not too late. We can do a great deal now to actually deliver this scheme.
Thank you. Mr Harra, paragraph 4.9 of the NAO report lists some of the actions that you've taken since 2019 to try to get back in touch with these young people. What assessment have you made of the impact that these initiatives have had? For example, in 2019 you included a mention of the schemes when you sent out young people's national insurance numbers for the first time. Did you monitor to see whether that made any difference, whether any young people actually read that bit of the letter?
Yes, so I mean, first of all, I think there are two different things here. I mean, one is evaluation, which is what the answer to the parliamentary question was about. But when it comes to connecting young people with these accounts as they mature, absolutely that is our objective. The primary responsibility, of course, rests with the account providers. Just as with any savings product, they need to keep in touch with their customer, and they're under obligations through the Financial Conduct Authority to do so. But in addition, we have been carrying out communications to raise awareness amongst young people that they have these accounts, and to raise awareness amongst them about how they can trace their accounts if they don't know where they are. And we've got a fulfilment route for that, as indeed does the Share Foundation and some other organisations as well. And between now and 2029, as more and more of these accounts mature, we'll keep under review whether that is working. We have done, we've sort of ramped up communications since sort of 2018, a whole variety of different ways, because obviously this is a cohort that we're trying to reach, which is not HMRC's usual customer base. We have been monitoring what the response is to that. So, for example, we can see spikes of contact from young people after different communication sort of events. Probably the best is when Martin Lewis mentions it on ITV. I immediately put 20 extra people onto the line because that has an impact. So we can see that the communications work, in that they create a spike of contact afterwards. But obviously, for people who have not yet reached 18 and won't until 2029, we've got to sustain that and keep that going, and keep picking up the cohorts.
Thank you. Could I ask you to write to the committee with details of the impact assessment you did after each of the initiatives that are shown in paragraph 4.9?
Yes, I'll give you what information you can.
Thank you. I want to come on now to the monitoring of performance, and particularly to the compliance of the providers. Part 3 of the NAO report refers to the fact that very often the providers don't actually provide you with the very small amount of information that you ask for. Mm-hmm. Why is that?
So I think in terms of monitoring compliance risks, we were quite active until 2013, but after that point, no new accounts are being opened, no new government subscriptions being put into it. We assessed that the tax compliance risk to HMRC from this was pretty low, and therefore we ramped down our activity, and that included switching off the fortnightly returns that we had previously required from account providers. And whilst they were still required to send us annual returns, I think it's fair to say that we did not rigorously enforce that, and we have now ramped that up more recently, because as accounts mature, that data is increasingly important. So for the statistics that we published this July, I'm confident that we will have a complete data set based on having enforced and chased up the returns that are missing.
What was the basis for you deciding that there was a low risk of non-compliance from these providers?
So, if you look at what are the risks of tax loss from this scheme, the main risk is people opening accounts when they're not eligible, or duplicate accounts, and that's what we actively tracked and monitored while people were opening accounts. But beyond that, the risks are relatively low. So there is a risk during the period since 2011 that people might oversubscribe to these accounts, but in practice, most children have a tax-free personal allowance in any event and a savings allowance. So the chances of us losing tax from this were pretty low. So just as with...
So when you've described it as low risk, you're talking about the potential risk to the public?
Yes, I'm talking about a compliance risk to HMRC and the tax system.
Have you done any assessment as to the risk that some of these young people might be losing money because either the fund has been badly managed or possibly even deliberately badly managed? Is that something have you assessed that risk at all?
So, HMRC does not regulate account providers. They're regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority, and all of these account providers have to be registered and authorised by them. So we don't actively have an active role in sort of protecting the consumer.
Some of that is more for the Treasury, which is an important point about how fees and funds, and perhaps Mr. Oldham's got something to add here.
Well, perhaps if I could just comment on that area. I mean, I think Jim Harry is absolutely right to talk about tax compliance risk, and I understand that. But as Peter has said, the issue here is about really whether the account providers are doing as much as they possibly can to join up these accounts. And the NAO report estimates that about £100 million a year in fees is being earned. Now, we know some account providers who are working really hard with this, particularly in NatWest, who have really excelled themselves in really putting their a lot of effort into trying to link up accounts. There's another 3 of the revenue allocated account providers who are working with our CTF register. But I have to say that that I think there are reasons to say that account providers are showing inadequate enthusiasm for linking up accounts. And I believe even under the treating customers fairly routine of the FCA, they have an obligation to do that. Next year that will be superseded by the consumer duty regime, but it won't apply to existing accounts until I understand July 2024. I believe it's really important to get the message through to FCA to put pressure on account providers so that they are actually cooperating with search registers like the CTF register. We've been following that up in some detail, and I had a report last night on the numbers actually responding to them, and in my view it was quite inadequate, particularly for the revenue allocated, which is where the greatest number of unclaimed accounts are. So I do think it would be really helpful if a committee could speak to the FCA about this.
Yeah. It's something we've noticed with other products we've looked at, that the legacy products have often very high fees because no one's really watching them, no one really cares about them. And
£100 million a year is a lot of income, and when you bear in mind that because so many of these accounts are addressee gone away and never registered, they don't have any expenses because they can't send it to an address because they don't know what the address is.
We've similar concerns about some of the auto-enrolment, so it's something we are very alert to, although some of this would fall to our sister committee, the Treasury Select Committee, but the point is well made. Thank you, Mr. Oldham. Mr. Grant.
Thank you. My understanding is that the £100 million estimate was assuming that everybody was charging the 1.5%, which is the maximum for stakeholder accounts. Nobody knows how much these young people have been charged if they have a non-stakeholder account, do they? That's not capped.
So there's a cap on the fees that can be charged for stakeholder accounts at 1.5% per annum, and all of the revenue allocated accounts, which are the accounts that are at greatest risk, if you like, of lack of engagement by the child and their family, are stakeholder accounts, so they're subject to that cap. But you're right, if a parent or guardian chose some other account, which is other than the stakeholder, then there's no cap in the CTF legislation for the fees, and that's just subject to general regulation by the FCA. I would add that, whilst the responsibility obviously for monitoring account provider sort of action to contact account holders rests with FCA, there are specific rules in the CTF regulations, for example, requiring account providers to contact the account holder in the year of their 17th birthday, and then thereafter to send at least annual statements if they don't engage with their account. Our experience of engaging with account providers is that they do comply with that obligation, and in addition, most of them will try to contact the account holder immediately before maturity to both remind them of maturity but also to tell them what they need to do to access their account.
If I may just comment briefly on that percentage ad valorem rate, 1.5%. When this was introduced, I think it was in 2005, 2004-5, when I was in the meeting in the Treasury when that rate was selected. That probably didn't seem an unreasonably high maximum ad valorem rate. Although I did actually propose at the time that if they'd allowed a maximum flat charge to be put alongside that, they could have actually reduced the ad valorem quite significantly. But obviously, I say that with the experience of an account provider. Now, I have to say that 1.5% looks very high indeed for fund management. On £1,900, you're talking about nearly £30 a year per account. On an account where basically there are very few costs against it, it almost straight to the bottom line. And that probably speaks volumes about why the account providers are not doing enough.
Thank you.
Right.
Mr. Grant.
Sorry, Mr. Walker, we want to come in there.
Thank you, Mr. Grant. Can I just say on the non-stakeholder charges, just to give you a flavour, when we take over responsibility for a child trust fund for someone who is in care, we generally ask for a statement on that account so we know where we stand. One of the non-stakeholder providers said quite happily, yes, £20 please, out of the child trust fund. That's the sort of charge just for providing a statement, which is, sorry to use the word, bonkers.
Yeah, no, that's right. We like straight talkers, Mr. Walker.
We refused to pay.
Thanks.
You refused to pay and you still got the statement?
We didn't get the statement.
You didn't get the statement?
Unfortunately, but we have to wait until they are duty bound to provide one at certain dates.
Yes.
Thank you. Finally from me, you seem to be describing a situation now. You certainly mentioned some providers that are behaving very responsibly, possibly going beyond what they're required to do to try and track down the account holders. Is it possible, or is it indeed likely, that some businesses are just saying, we've got no interest at all in finding out who these people are because we're getting a 1.5% of them every year? Could there be firms out there who are quite happy to let the fund basically run down to nothing because it's all been swallowed up by their fees? Is there anything that can be done to prevent that from happening? I know we've mentioned the Financial Conduct Authority, and my views on their effectiveness are quite well known. Is it only the FCA that stands between firms and literally just getting money for nothing every year until the fund is run, the trust fund is?
Yes, I think that is a risk. I mean, I'm absolutely appalled by the suggestion in the NAO report that that there could be dormancy considered at the end of these. These are not, older folk, who are saved up all their lives and maybe, in a different situation. These are young people from low-income families who really need this money to actually get them started in adult life. And I think there is a real risk that that they could be, just sitting there, anticipating dormancy. I'm aware that that some of the revenue allocated accounts sit in mutual organisations who don't have a huge amount of other business alongside it as well, and that may be what part of a reluctance to it. But there are others who are commercial, and they're doing the same thing of being very reluctant about this. And I think it is a big issue, this, and I'd be very grateful if we can ask the FCA to take a bit of a focus on this.
Ms. Antcliffe.
Yeah, I think, thank you. Not to take away from the responsibility to the SA, I think it is worth just noting these accounts, even kind of as they mature, still attract growth. They are savings accounts, and actually, even though there are fees on them, the growth of the account does outstrip that cap on the fees. So on those accounts that are within the cap, we would expect the growth of the accounts. They wouldn't sit there until they ran down to nothing. They would still continue to attract.
I think it is fair to say one of the reasons that I converted my daughter's account into a junior ISA is that the interest rates were just withering away because it was a legacy project that nobody had a real interest in, which is a whole wider issue this committee is quite interested in. So I think, but point taken. Mr. Grant, last. Okay. Just before we move on to Ms. Olivia Blake MP, you talked. I think you mentioned, Mr. Oldham, that West was doing a good job. Can you just be really clear about what they're doing, and are they the only one compared with those who are just letting them sit there and move potentially to dormancy?
Well, so NatWest are not only cooperating in full with the CTF register run by the Tracing Group, which is absolutely key to actually a search process, and maybe we could just discuss that a little bit as well, because It's a very, very effective system. But they also contribute £40,000 a year to the cost of actually publicising that search facility. And I have to say that they made a lot of difference, and they're not one of the largest revenue allocated account providers, so it's really good of them to do that. None of the other account providers are actually contributing anything in terms of actually making the awareness. They are, as I say, 3 others are actually cooperating.
Have they done that proactively, or have you asked for support from some of those?
No, the thing is that they have very much volunteered that and put it forward from that point of view. I might just, if I may...
Just on that particular point, I think Mr. and Mrs. Drummond wanted to come in.
Yes, I just want to ask Mr. Oldham, because there is a statutory they have to report back, because every provider actually sent those annual statements, I think it's on the 10th, 15th and 17th birthday. I mean, is there any evidence to say that they're not doing it? Some providers aren't doing it.
Well, if you don't know what their address is, you haven't got anything anywhere you can send it to. So, you know...
Right, okay.
So nothing would go out from that point of view.
Okay. So how common, I mean, what percentage do you think is in that category then?
In the revenue allocated account section, we reckon it could be over 80% of those. As I say, when I analysed the 83,000 accounts which we were administering within the share centre, basically it came to about 86%. The numbers are actually in the NAO report from that point of view.
So they won't have received a statement at all, so hence the lack of engagement, because they don't, okay.
Absolutely.
Sorry, just to pick up on the NatWest point, as Sir Geoffrey was just suggesting, that actually, have you used NatWest's example as something to try and push other providers to do?
Yes, in fact, the tracing group, which actually provides that interface with the account providers, has spoken to all of the account providers, particularly the revenue allocated ones, in the last, literally in the last 2 or 3 weeks since the NAO report came out. There are 5 of them who are expressing some interest. The majority are not revenue allocated accounts. It's account providers, but interestingly enough, actually in one of those, which is not a revenue allocated account provider, actually reports an 11% unclaimed rate. So it's not just in the revenue allocated account area. It is actually a problem. It's much worse in the revenue allocated.
Basically, because this has slightly hit the agenda, there's been a bit of publicity thanks to the National Audit Office's work on this.
Yeah.
That there's a little, maybe some of these other providers might start coughing up.
It's been really helpful, and your interest in it will be very, very important in terms of raising the focus which can be put on this. I have to say that, I mean, I mentioned to you the answer to John Ashworth's question. You will be aware that there was a debate in Westminster Hall in 2019, which was very much something which we initiated, and it was read by Helen Goodman. And John Glenn answered on behalf of the Treasury. And I recall walking out from that at Westminster Hall afterwards, and John Glenn turned to me and he said, there are no lost child trust funds. And I know what he meant. He meant they're all safe. They're all sitting with regulated account providers. I know that too. But the fact is, for the young people, they are lost. And I think what it does is to explain to you why, and I believe this is the main problem actually for Jim, that I don't believe Treasury has actually given enough priority to HMRC to put a focus on this. And I think that's one of the key problems, that actually people in HMRC would like to do much more, but I don't believe ministers in the Treasury are allowing them to do it. And they're not giving them the budget to do it, and they're not giving them the priority. Now, Jim will probably tell me that that's not entirely correct, but a lot more is in his discretion.
We'll come to some of this a bit later, but yeah, but I mean, we've got a quick response now, Mr.
The committee is very familiar with the sort of budgetary constraints that HMRC operates under, but this is obviously one of a whole range of things that we have to deliver. Whilst we undoubtedly ramped down our focus on it between sort of 2011 and 2018-2019, we have been ramping it up as the first cohort reaches 18, and we will continue to monitor the extent to which maturing CTFs get accessed and what more we might need to do. But so it is one of a whole range of priorities. We currently have about 11 full-time equivalent staff who work solely on linking young people with their CTFs. And we can flex that up as needed. And so, for example, as I said, when Martin Lewis talks about it on his programme, I put 20 people on. I've got up to 50 people trained who I can put on it in an instant. So, if today's hearing creates a spike of interest, I'll be able to make sure that we service that demand.
Thank you.
Chair, I don't know if I could just...
Very briefly, Mr. Hall, could we do,
Yeah, I'd appreciate your...
Because we may come to this later.
But one of the really important aspects about the search register offered through the government gateway is that it uses data which goes back to when the account was first opened, which was 18 years ago, and many accounts have actually moved on to other providers, and people don't know where they are anymore. And the HMRC has not been able to keep that record up to date. And one of the values of doing what we do with the CTF register is we engage directly into the account providers for 60% of the base, and we can provide the answer within 24 hours without actually engaging or troubling HMRC at all. We make no fees for this.
We were very interested in our preparation to the difference and actually the value of a body like yours that can do work differently.
So what we would like to do is to volunteer our service without charge to the government, to the HMRC, to work in partnership, to focus on 16 to 20-year-old young people, because that's the area that we really need to work with. And we don't want to make any charge for this. We want to just literally put ourselves at your disposal and to work in partnership with Jim. And if one thing came out of this discussion today, that would be ideal for us, because then we would get the coverage in DWP, we'd get the coverage in schools, and all over the
good pitch, and I think it's something we recognise the value of what you offered when we learnt about your organisation in preparation for the session. Because to my shame, I hadn't heard about you until preparing for the session, probably because
we won't charge for it. I promise you.
Good pitch for business. But actually, on the point of supporting young people, Ms. Olivia Blake MP.
Yeah, I just want to follow up a bit on advertising, because I've just been sat here brainstorming my own ideas about how you could communicate with young people. Lots of people who turn 18 register to vote. Those date of births are collected by local authorities. What is the department doing to reach out to people within Duluth to ask about communicating through that system of voter registration? Every 16-year-old is sent a national insurance number. That could include a communication about this money. Every person who goes to university and a lot of colleges interacts with UCAS. Why aren't you paying for advertising on UCAS? Because that is something that a lot of young people use. When people register for university, I could go on and on and on.
I think Ms. Blake has a local summer campaign for her young people. Exactly. Sheffield Hallam's young people know very much what's going on.
So I just want to know, why aren't you reaching out to parts of government and parts of our education system which are engaging with these people at a point when they're turning 18?
Ms. Antcliffe, I think it's your territory.
I'll come in if that's okay. So, I think there is a lot that we have done. Some of those things you've mentioned we have either done or are kind of planning to do. So from 2018 we produced leaflets that went out to our volunteer tax ambassadors who visit schools. From 2019 we changed the national insurance letter, as you suggested, so it now includes a reference to child trust funds and information about how a young person can contact us.
It would require someone to read through the whole letter. I think it's at the bottom of the letter, isn't it?
We did try and get a rather larger commentary in it, but it was actually our initiative getting it in there in the letter in the first place.
Mr. Oldham, okay.
It was very brief.
Yeah, so it is included in that. We have done some work through things like working mums websites to help raise awareness, and we between kind of 2020 and the summer of 2022 put monthly social media posts out. Obviously lots of young people are also on social media, and that we saw spikes of contact when those posts went out, and we have been looking at what we can do in partnership with UCAS. One of the things we need to do is keep an eye on these matured funds and see how the work we are already doing and funding increases access, and as kind of the numbers become clearer we may decide we need to do further outreach and pay for some further communications, but that needs to be balanced along the kind of constraints we operate in. But it's really important that we are reaching these young people through those routes already.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. That's good to hear that you're doing some of that, but I think obviously more would be welcome, and I think it's particularly important for disabled young people, and I'm just going to ask a couple of questions about some of the evidence that we've had from the Down Syndrome Association, who have written to us to outline the issues for young people with Down syndrome, but this obviously applies to other young people with learning disabilities and the trouble that they're having accessing. And they call in their evidence for much more public education and awareness to parents about banking safeguards and explaining that if you've got appointeeship for your welfare and benefits, that won't allow you to access this fund, and a deputyship would be needed. Would that be something that you'd be likely to take up and try and get that message out to parents?
Communication with parents is really important. Actually, the responsibility for who can manage the finances of vulnerable young people sits with the MOJ, and we're aware of some of the challenges that have been raised recently about people who've had to take on that responsibility in order to access the Child Trust Fund. We know that MOJ are trying to simplify that legislation and are kind of looking
Just
at
to be
that.
clear, it is in legislation. Apparently it's a 6-page letter for GPs to complete before someone can access it if they've got no mental capacity. And
Right, if you're a guardian of someone with limited mental capacity, there is a kind of it's not just about child trust funds. There is a much wider kind of
okay, so
process
because it's the
in place.
wider thing, that's the problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's there to, obviously to protect young people, but we do also need to make sure that it works.
Absolutely, and I always say protection is really, really important. Deputyship is for life, though, and obviously this is happening at a point in someone's life, and that's a big responsibility for any parent to take on, and it costs them a lot of money. And there was a report in the BBC saying that up to 80,000 of these accounts could be held by children with learning disabilities and not having mental capacity, but only 15 in 2021 were approved by the Court of Protection. So that is a massive thing to simplify, as you've just said. What are you doing to improve the experience of people who are going through the Court of Protection, and what work are you doing with the Ministry of Justice to make sure that access to the Child Trust Funds is possible for children who lack mental capacity?
I think, as I said, we continually have conversations across government about how we can make sure things are working, but the guardianship process and that system is the responsibility of the MOJ. As I understand it, where an individual has some capacity, there is a kind of hasting power of attorney, which again is also a MOJ matter, but that is a simpler system that people can use where the young person has some capability but not full capability in order to access.
Sounds like from what you're saying, though, that the issue around child trust funds is not so much child trust funds, it's more about the guardianship side of that, and that can be very clunky. So there is no specific issue around child trust funds. Is that right, Mr.
I think the issue obviously crystallises with child trust funds often for many families, because that's the point at which this account matures. We are now able to access these funds. We've got a particular procedure that we need to go through to do that. So whilst the law applies generally to all the assets of incapacitated
many assets a child has, yeah.
Yes, the MOJ, two things they've done. I mean, first of all, they do waive the fees for people where the only asset that the young person has is their child trust fund. They have also recently consulted on what they can do to simplify the procedure, and once they have decided not to proceed with some of the proposals in that, I think they are very much alive to the issue.
Given the nature of child trust funds, though, right, I'm a mother, I've got 2 children. They're twins, right? One has a learning disability, one doesn't. I put the same...
It's a theoretical situation, in case anyone out there
sorry.
because
No, obviously. Yeah, anyway. And so, yeah, theoretically, I've got 2 children, I've got twins, one has a learning disability, one doesn't. I put the same amount of money into those accounts because I feel that they're both my children and I want to treat them fairly. So when one gets to 18, they can access their account and go off running and enjoy that money, which is their right, because it's their money. The money I have been putting in to my disabled child's account, I can no longer access for my child's benefit. Is that right? Was that communicated to people?
I think obviously the issue is that these people
wouldn't it have been better for me to keep that money in my own account?
So, obviously the issue is that these account holders are no longer children at that point. They are young adults, and it is right that the law protects vulnerable adults, but also that it enables people who have got their best interests at heart to help manage their assets for them. And I think we can definitely see and the experience has sort of come to light as a result of the maturity of child trust funds, that is, that parents of incapacitated young adults are finding that very difficult to navigate effectively. I think the MOJ have recognised that. They have taken some actions such as I say, waiving the fees, and they have actively looked at whether there's anything they can do to simplify the procedure and make it more effective. And I'm sure they will keep working on that. In the meantime, HMRC, we have made sure that our guidance for parents sets out, if you have an incapacitated young person, here is where you can find out what you need to do. So I think it's an issue that we're alert to, and I know the MOJ are alert to, but there's a balance that needs to be found here between protecting young adults and actually helping the people who've got their best interests.
I think this is not so much, there's an issue about child trust funds, because as you had it, because they mature at this point, but I think that the guardianship issues are wider, and we all have experience of that to a degree. Anything else, Ms. Blake?
I just want to ask a little bit about children in care. So why are the trust funds about half the amount of the average for children in care?
Perhaps I could answer that point, if I may. I don't know if you'd like to just pass that diagram round so that people have a copy of it. But this is for young people in care, this picture. And it's a chart of the average account value by annual cohort. Okay, the figures in the red are junior ISAs, which apply right throughout the range, because they basically picked up on some of the older young people too. And the figures in green are the child trust funds. So actually, we're looking at a situation where for the oldest child trust fund owners, they were fortunate enough to receive two payments, one at age 7 and obviously the one at birth. And the growth on top of that too. And so you can see the sort of rise in terms of the value over that last bit. And that's why these accounts for 18 to 20-year-olds at the moment are so important to find. But actually, you can see it quickly falls off. So you're down to about 1,100, and then it drops still lower. And so when you're down to age 11, it really is, a really very small amount. And the average amount for young people in care, and bear in mind that what we're doing here is looking after young people up to the age of, they reach the 18th birthday, they are the less valuable ones for that period. And that's the reason why the numbers are quite different. The £1,900 in the NAO report, of course, covers a whole scheme, including, the wealthy families who are able to put in their own contributions as well, and a lot of contributions were put in. And so across the board, they do tend to be worth a lot more when you get to these younger age groups. The other thing I might just say about this chart is that you can see how modest the junior ISA allocation is, which has been set at £200 now since 2012, but I understand that there's no funds for actually inflation uplifting that, but that's another matter.
Let's not stray into that. That's another problem.
Okay.
And we're always a bit wary of taking figures just presented to us, so
I know that.
We would need full referencing on that.
I thought it would be helpful to give you this chart, because it does answer the question.
No, thank you. That was very helpful. To Mr. Harra then, how will you prevent disadvantaged groups experiencing poor service from future schemes, as some children who are disabled and some children in care are obviously struggling with now? Is there any lessons from this that you would apply in the future to make sure that these children are thought about at the beginning of a scheme being set up?
So, obviously, as we've said, the ability for the guardians of incapacitated young adults to access their assets is not responsibility of HMRC, but there is no doubt that the government has learned lessons from the experience of CTFs and is searching for what the best solution is to that. I think in the case of child trust funds, and I've been involved from the outset. I was actually involved in the sort of implementation of the IT systems back in at the start of the scheme in 2005. We've certainly learned lessons about how to run such a scheme. In particular, as Mr. Oldham has has mentioned, about of the 6.3 million accounts, about 1.7 million of them had to be set up by HMRC because after 12 months the parent or guardian of the child had not taken action, and that there's a risk that lack of engagement tracks right through to the maturity of the account and beyond. So I'm sure that a lesson is how we segment this population, because they range from children who've got very engaged parents who will keep on top of their financial affairs, through to children whose families won't do that, and who therefore need a different approach. I think those would be two key learnings.
I don't know if I could just comment briefly on this, but I do think, having actually been alongside this scheme all the way through, that when you have a long-term scheme, it really does need consistent focus throughout the whole period. Yeah. And in my experience, it's easier to hold that service monitoring to account if you contract it out rather than you try and do it within government. Government is not very good at handling the long term. As we are all aware. And
we're talking, I think we're going to come to some of this at the end, because I'm concerned about some of the wider lessons on this for sure, Mr. Alderman, point well made.
Yeah.
And how do you think, this is to you, Mr. Alderman, how much do you think children in care have benefited when they've been able to access their funds? Do you think it has had a positive impact on them?
Well, the answer to that is really hugely. The thing is that in our process for young people in care, we have a very disciplined handover process at the end. We also have a financial awareness programme called the Stepladder Plus programme, which is incentivised learning. Young people can add an extra £1,500 to their account as a result of taking the 6 steps. And there is also a really vigorous system of seminars for seminars for local authority individuals, so that they can actually keep up to date with how things are going. Could I ask, Anthony, perhaps you'd like to just explain about how effective that is to make sure we get the handover of accounts and make sure,
Because we deal with 211 local authorities, their turnover of staff is quite high. So we provided a series of learnings so that all of our contact to children in care is through the local authority. It's not usually direct with the young person. So we've instigated this so that local authorities understand that the money is there, and we try to get them to engage the young person from the age of 16 onwards with their account, because as we learn, by the time they're 18, if they've disappeared from the care system, it's quite often too late to get them to engage. So we're trying to get the local authority staff to engage with them from 16 onwards, so that they take responsibility for their account prior to their 18th birthday. And the letters that we receive from them are just fantastic. We ask them to let us know how it's affected them, and through the stepladder scheme we also ask them to give us their thoughts on where they see their financial future going after age 18. And again, some of those responses are so uplifting. It's absolutely fantastic that when we do get to them, it proves it does make a huge difference, because to them, they don't have the bank of mum and dad, and £1,500 or £2,000 or whatever makes the world of difference to them. It may not be mean as much to anybody else in this room, but for an 18-year-old who's just leaving the care system, if they suddenly find they've got £2,000, huge difference.
Absolutely.
Then finally, I guess, to either of you, I'm not sure who would prefer to ask this, but is there anything more that you'd like to see in terms of support to children in care to help them make the most of their trust fund? It sounds like you're doing great work, but is that consistent at the minute?
Well, I mean, at the present moment on the Stepladder Plus programme, that is, all the incentives are raised voluntarily. And we've received over 400,000 from the British Bankers Association in January, which has enabled us to open this for every local authority throughout the United Kingdom. Over the last 3 months, we've had 500 young people just come in and register straight away for that. We've currently got a major social investment consultancy called Mutual Ventures producing a business case for coming up with a partnership between government and the corporate sector to provide ongoing incentivised learning payments coming in. which are not going to be a huge burden to the cost to the government, but actually they do transform the attitudes, because what you find is that as they go through this course, they start by thinking, oh, well, I'll earn £150 for doing a literacy or £150 for the numeracy. But by the time they've done the financial awareness, you can feel their attitude transforming. And on step 4, they write 250 and 500 words on what they're going to do in their life going forwards. And it is really, as Anthony says, it's so exciting to see that coming through. You can see the transformation. We're talking about significant reductions in the NEET status, which currently is 40% for care leavers at the moment. We want to see that come well down as a result of providing incentivised learning. And we think it will do that. It will have that effect. So that's really good. I'd just like to say, just briefly also, in connection with the whole issue of getting involved with young people in care, the Children's Commissioner in Wales has taken a real interest in this area and is writing to all the local authorities to getting them to engage more actively. We would welcome the Children's Commissioner in England and in Scotland and Northern Ireland doing the same thing and taking a vigorous interest in this area. It really is so important. Every young person born into this world has the same potential to achieve amazing things as adults. What we need to make sure is that they have some resources and the life skills to be able to do that job properly. And, you know...
this is an opportunity, actually, with the Child Trust Funds maturing to help engage them on
absolutely.
That, get that loud and clear.
Absolutely, at the
Thank
heart
you.
of it. Yeah.
Flick Drummond.
Okay, so slight rewind, I'm afraid. That's the problem with each person answering questions. Going back to 4.14, when the MOJ has stated it's not willing to deviate from the court of protection process, which I get, but some providers have unilaterally agreed a process for accounts below 5,000. Is that of concern to you? Because I know the government's looked at it and they have not agreed with that. Is it wise for the MOJ really to allow a large proportion of the account based to be settled on the sector's own risk?
Well, it's our understanding that the account providers are using their discretion in a large number of cases for actually handling that issue. And I think they are handling it in a mature and sensible way. Okay. That's our assessment. But Anthony, I don't know whether you would have
Mr. Walker?
No, it's fine. As they say, it's at their risk. And they are the ones that are dealing directly with the young person concerned. They've all put their own protection in place for using the scheme, but they are happy to do it on their own risk.
And there's no concern to HMRC on that?
So I mean, as Mr. Walker said, I mean, my understanding is that the account providers who've decided to do this at their own risk. So in the event that money is misused and they have not gone through the proper sort of legal protection route, then that risk then lies with the account provider for having done that, and they have clearly decided that that is a sort of commercial risk that they're willing to take.
They have their own safeguards they put in place for interviewing the parent, presumably. And
I assume so, because obviously they carry a financial risk if they get that wrong. But they, as you say, I mean, the Ministry of Justice has concluded that it would not be right to amend the law to work in that way.
Okay, and the MOJ's very kindly waived the fee, but there must be some cost implication for these between the 63,000 and 126,000 account holders. There must be some cost implication either for the providers or for the HMRC on how we're going to handle all those numbers.
So there's, it's not HMRC's area
MOJ,
of responsibility. Yes, so there are a whole range of issues, I think, that people have brought up in relation to accessing and managing the accounts of people who are incapacitated. One, obviously, is the costs of the legal process, and as you say, MOJ waive those costs in some circumstances. But there's also just the ongoing responsibilities that the person takes on and the reporting and recording that they need to do. So there's a whole range of factors, I think, that need to be looked at together. And as I say, the MOJ have consulted on some things and have ruled some things out, and will no doubt continue to keep this under review.
So who's picking up the tab on it then? Of all these processes, the MOJ is it?
So it's a court process. So yes, to the extent that the fees have been waived, that is the government is picking that up presumably through the court system and MOJ.
And then my last very brief question is. why don't they use the DWP appointee scheme status to help those people who lack the capacity to look after their own funds? And would the HMRC have any concerns about a DWP appointee status doing that?
I understand that's the status that's used when children are under 18 for things like managing disability living allowance. Is that right?
It goes beyond 18, I believe.
I think it goes beyond 18, I think.
I think again that would be something that would need to be referred to MOJ in terms of whether or not that is the right route for these young people to be able to access those funds.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Drummond. John Mortimer MP.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to bring the focus, if I can now, back to outcomes. So this is probably another question for Mr. Harra and Mr. Oldham. One of the 4 policy objectives, as you'll know, was to help people understand the benefits of saving and investments. So I'd like to ask you, what do you think, what difference has the Child Trust Fund scheme made to young people's understanding of finances and their ability to manage them? So perhaps Mr. Harra first.
So, an interim evaluation was carried out in 2009 and published in 2011, and what that found was actually there was no statistical significant difference in the kind of savings of young people. It did find there was a £600 increase in the amount saved by those living in rented accommodation, and some parents had opted to open savings accounts for young people who weren't eligible for child trust funds when they opened one for a younger sibling, but overall it showed there was no statistically significant change.
We've not had a look at that since 2011. There's been no further assessment made. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that what drives the Share Foundation is the whole concept of intergenerational rebalancing, because, you know, it's this thing about providing resources and life skills which really provides an opportunity really to change our world significantly for the better. So the thing is, evaluating the scheme is really, really important. And hence we were really grateful when a team from Bristol University approached us literally a few weeks ago and said, could they do some research with us into young people who found their child trust funds. We have so far linked up through findctf.sharefund.org about 34,000 young people with accounts worth about £65 million. And we have the ability to write to them and to ask them to take part in a survey. And we will be doing that detailed survey and actually getting answers back, you know, in terms of the change that it's made in their lives and what sort of value this has going forward. I have to say that this is alongside quite a bit of international interest. I mean, we've already had discussions with California, which is introducing a similar scheme to this, to the Child Trust Fund. I've had discussions with charities in Paris and France from this point of view. What the United Kingdom has done in terms of introducing this scheme is pretty unique across the world in terms of bringing in intergenerational rebalancing. It is extremely important that we demonstrate that it has worked, and that's why we've got to join up these accounts. Because if we want this kind of scheme to come in the future, we cannot have governments turning around and saying, well, the last time you did this, you know, you didn't...
You're preaching to the converted here, Mr. Oldham. Right. We are big on evaluation.
So we'll keep you in touch with the evaluation with Bristol. And really excited to hear that.
I think that leads on to my next question, really. This is probably for you, Mr. Oldham, and you, Mr. Walker, you probably know more about this, is that, of course, another one of the objectives was to build on financial education to make people more financially adept and aware. And do you think that people are leaving school today properly equipped to understand that? And has the scheme had any impact on that?
Well, absolutely not is the answer to that. I think they say about 25% of students leave school saying that they've been adequately prepared in financial awareness. I've asked ministers over and over again to introduce a financial awareness GCSE, and I've had that turned down more times than I can remember. It's just extraordinary that how they think maths can carry the whole subject, which it just doesn't do from that point of view. So, yes, I do think that's really important. I have to say that for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, you know, incentivized learning is absolutely critical. In fact, when we first brought it in, it was following an afternoon spent here in Portcullis House downstairs with a whole raft of MPs coming through, and they were all saying, we need to see that the young person is engaged and actually part of that process. I also had discussions with Mohammed Yunus, who ran Grameen Bank and introduced microfinance. I said, why do you use loans rather than grants in your system? He said, because it builds accountability. And actually it's that communication and the accountability which actually develops the understanding and the financial awareness as you go along. Incentivized learning does the same thing. When you start, it's just a payment for taking one element of a course. By the time you've finished, it has transformed the attitudes. And that is a really exciting thing about it, as Anthony was saying earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that applies particularly in a constituency like mine, where I don't think we do have a lot of deprivation. We had a lot of children care and things like that, but we also have a lot of families that are just very decent, hard-working families, but that financial education isn't part of their remit, so they just won't be aware this is there and they won't have done it. And I think it's very sad that this scheme's failed to reach the very people that would have benefited from it, you know, in the main.
Yes, I mean, particularly for young people in care, they go through an experience where their expectations have been hammered down all the time. And, you know, insecurity is the primary, you know, concern that they have. You know, they don't have anything stable to hold on to. And actually, it is that transformation process is fundamentally important to start building confidence and to give them a chance to achieve their potential. I mean, some people can do amazing things. I believe Michael Gove was in care originally. Chris Akabusi was. You know, I mean, I could give you a whole raft of people who've done wonderful things. We could do this across the board much, much deeper.
But you don't believe that we've lost that opportunity with this? It's still not too late if we can get the message
Absolutely
out
not
to
too late. With this scheme, it's ready for harvesting. The crop is all yellow. It's in the field.
I love your analogies.
You know, I mean, government ministers should not say, look, we're not interested in that. We had, that was last year, you know, just chuck away that crop. You know, it's not a matter of that. It's there to be harvested. And now we get the harvesters out and we take it off the field.
I mean, Mr. Howard, turning back to you then, which parts of government are responsible for achieving these intended benefits and value from the government's investment in the Child's Trust Fund?
I think back when this policy was being set up, HMRC obviously had the job of administering the scheme in a sort of mechanical sense and making sure everyone got their accounts and got their subscriptions, and you know, now that they're maturing, making sure that people are able to be reunited with their accounts. There was, I recall, an aim at the time that it would also be used in education, that you know, every young person in this cohort in a classroom would have a CTF, and therefore there would be opportunities, you know, to use that for financial education, for example. But it is the case that since, you know, 2010, 2011, you know, there've been no new entrants, cohorts going through after that. You know, they don't have a CTF, and there's nothing there to have that same engagement with. But
yeah, the thing is that I have to say, quite apart from the Share Foundation, I'm currently involved with a research programme up in Cambridge, which is looking specifically into generational rebalancing. And we really would, you know, we're using the information that we're learning through the Share Foundation to actually put new ways of bringing schemes like this much more effective, much more targeted. You know, the universality of the Child Trust Fund is really not necessary. You know, it could be much more targeted in terms of its application. And actually bringing in things like incentivised learning alongside it, which will give it the real drive for giving young people the opportunity to achieve their potential. And those are the sort of things we want to do.
So finally, just a quick off then, is what do you think has been achieved towards the aim of helping people develop the habit of saving and making better financial choices from the Child Trust Fund? What has been achieved?
Well, I think quite a lot has been achieved for those who've actually engaged with them. I will be able to tell you more when we get the Bristol University results come back in.
Yeah.
And I really look forward to come back to you with that, if I may, because, you know, it's very important you do survey these things. I mean, what we're doing with the SEP Ladder programme is to do an intense programme of research. We have a PhD student up in Cambridge who is, you know, specifically looking at the impact of creating, you know, a really significant reduction in the NEET status. And, you know, you have to do the research. You have to find out what's happening as a result. And we're very much engaged with that.
Thank you. But Mr. Harrett, what do you think has been achieved? And do you think that there's been a problem with education and more could have been achieved if better education had been in place in schools?
So I think, I mean, obviously, you know, political decisions were made 12 years ago that different policies needed to be pursued to achieve these objectives, and the evaluation at the time showed that the scheme was having pretty limited impact in terms of the cost at that point, because obviously the cost being the government contributions into the accounts. But it's been my department's job to make sure that those accounts keep running to maturity, that parents who wish to make subscriptions into them can continue to do so, and now since 2020, as account holders reach 18, that they're able to be access their account or be reunited with it if they don't know where it is. And we've got that task up till 2029 when the final sort of cohort reach 18. So we're about a third of the way through that process, so we've got an ongoing responsibility.
It's more about HMRC's involvement in administering the scheme.
Yes.
I mean, what's been your involvement to build on the financial education for young people and their parents from it? Have you had any involvement in that at all? Because that seems to be where the problems lie.
Antcliffe.
We haven't, particularly as HMRC, had a role in managing the education. So we've done lots to kind of raise awareness of the scheme, to help people know it exists, that those young people who turn 18 can access their account, and then at that point they may be able to access further.
So who should have been responsible?
We have a set of, we have a set of tax ambassadors that go out into schools to teach young people about tax and about how to manage that as they leave school. And
this is specifically about this scheme and about
but as
saving
part of that,
and investment.
As part of that tax ambassador work, we do focus on CTFs, and so there are resources that we give to our tax ambassadors and also to other stakeholder groups to use in schools in relation to CTFs. Obviously our motive at this stage is to raise awareness of CTFs and make sure that the young people realise they have one somewhere. But it is part and parcel of a wider effort to educate people about tax and savings.
But part of it was that part of this specific scheme, one of the specific objectives was to get better education for children and their parents.
Ms. Antcliffe can maybe
I have to say,
bring in Ms. Antcliffe first, and then Ms.
I was just going to build on what Mr. Harris said, which was that kind of building on that, as the kind of young people have matured, we've expanded those resources specifically for that reason, to make sure that there is more information about child trust funds and how they work, and that people who are, say, going into schools, and our work with universities does raise awareness of the different things that how young people can access their accounts, and let them know that they're there, to make sure that there is an understanding.
Mr. Oldham.
I have to say that the role of MAPS in this area, the Money and Pension Service, should not be overlooked. It's really important, and MAPS has taken a real interest in this, particularly in Wales. A lady called Lee Phillips, who actually runs the MAPS service in Wales, who has been absolutely focused and dedicated in this area. And it's a great credit to them. They're a quasi sort of governmental organisation, and they have been working quite hard in this area, and they do deserve a bit of a mention.
But that's on wider education, isn't it? I'm trying to
it's
focus on
specifically in relation to the Child
this
Trust
scheme.
Fund,
right?
Particularly in Wales. This is where the interest has come through. They actually have a low-income section within the government in Wales, which has been very vibrant in its interest. That's why we've converted all of our facilities into Welsh language as an alternative alongside English for Find CTF, for the Talk CTF page, and so on. It's been really effective.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mortimer. Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, Deputy Chair.
Yes, Mr. Oldham. Slightly outside the scope of this specific inquiry, but you did refer to it, therefore I'm going to ask you a question about it. You did refer to the fact that a targeted scheme, as a rather more than a universal scheme, could actually have a great role in reducing those people who are in care and their dependency on the system. Have you done any work on that?
We have done quite a lot of work. I mean, one of the essential features of this is, the sensible thing for government to do would be to hypothecate an element of inheritance tax, which is £6 billion a year at the moment, and is long-term savings within families, which is then the ideal opportunity to recycle that into disadvantaged young people, to get these sort of accounts underway and to get them moving. As part of that, we have written up quite a bit of work on this. I mean, not entirely within the Share Foundation. The work I'm doing up in Cambridge at the moment is under Share Alliance, which will be a separately registered charity, which intergenerational rebalancing is a key part of that. And there are proposals within that, and the PhD student I referred to earlier up in Cambridge is specifically involved with actually looking at how this element of introducing a much more egalitarian form of capitalism can work. But it is going, as you say, a bit beyond what we do in the Share Foundation.
Let us have details of that. And slightly going also beyond the scope of this committee, but you did again refer to it. You've asked numerous ministers over numerous times to introduce a GCSE in financial education, but much lesser than that. Again, maybe you let us have a note offline rather than taking up time of this committee about your ideas of how you could better financial education in schools.
Well, I mean, I've analysed GCSE, the quantum of results, over a number of years, and I can see the number who've taken the primary ones. You have to go a long way down, except for maths, to find anything which is related to financial awareness, and that's a large part of the problems. Anyone, you only have to talk with your children or your grandchildren about taking maths, and they will say that there's a very limited amount of financial awareness which comes through.
I think there's some PHSE, but I think we are in danger of straying off subject. I think, Mr. Oldham, I think everyone's going to be looking up everything you're doing on the internet after this session, whatever we put in our report on the issue, because I think we're obviously fascinated by some of the things you've been raising today. And I think we now...
Thank you, Chair.
Turn to Mr. Peter Grant, MP. Mr. Grant.
Thanks, Chair. I want to go back to the discussion we had earlier about the arrangements for protecting the interests of young people who've been in care and of young people and young adults who don't have the mental capacity to manage their own affairs. In both of these, legislation and very often the administrative arrangements in Scotland are different from they are in other parts of the United Kingdom. Are there any particular issues, for example, around adults without mental capacity that apply in Scotland that don't apply elsewhere? Are you comfortable that the arrangements that are in place are working as effectively?
I have to say in this area, we are particularly indebted to the Account Providers Trade Association, and in particular Nigel Banfield, who was responsible for the work on these young people. And I would like to mention that because it was largely due to his initiative that we have anything coming through in this area. Anthony, would you like to just comment on what the Scottish experience is like? Because my understanding is it's relatively limited.
It is. The problem we have is that as soon as a young person turns 18, our responsibility falls away. And we have no difference in the way those young people are treated by ourselves from Scotland to England, Wales or Northern Ireland, because, as Mr. Oldham said, the responsibility falls to the provider to enable access to those funds. So it's the provider that will be able to better tell you whether there are any other difficulties in Scotland as opposed to any other part of the United Kingdom.
Okay, but for example, in preparing for a young person reaching the age of 18, if that young person doesn't have mental capacity to manage their own affairs, for example, we heard about the position of the MOJ that applies in other parts of the United Kingdom. Are there any different arrangements that need to be made to hand over effectively for someone to take over the affairs of a young person? I see Mr. Harra.
If I pick it up, sorry, I mean, you're quite right, Mr. Grant. We've obviously referred to MOJ, which is for England and Wales. My understanding is the financial deputyship rules are very similar in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Obviously, one key difference in Scotland is that people are adults at 16 rather than 18. That doesn't change when the CTF matures, but it might change when people start taking deputyship action in relation to a young person now. But otherwise, my understanding is the processes are very similar.
But I have to say, in relation to Scotland, I mean, Mr. Grant, we would really welcome more emphasis being given by the Scottish Government towards this whole area of child trust funds and, what we're doing.
I think you're lobbying a very good advocate, I have to say.
Well, we see it in Wales. So
I have to say, Mr. Oldham, you're using this committee very effectively to get across the message. But I think we're all with you, because we've all got young people in our constituency who will be benefiting. Can I just do some fairly quick fire, I hope, to HMRC particularly on this. One of the things is about the resources you've got to do this, and you've obviously you use your good Mandarin language, Mr. Harra, about we have a lot of things to do and the resources. Do you think you've got enough resources, or are you bidding for more from Treasury or allocating more as these come to maturity?
So I mean, we don't have a ring-fenced allocation for this. It is just one of the many things we need to do. Currently we administer it with about 11 full-time equivalent people, and their main task is linking young people with their accounts. We can flex that, but the scale of this is such that we have not bid separately for it.
You're not overrun, and okay.
And Chair, if I could just, I know,
because I think I might be coming. Yes, we might be having the same thought. But go ahead, Mr. Oldham.
But very briefly, just to say, I would say again that we really do place ourselves at the disposal of HMRC to work in partnership. We work very closely with one individual in HMRC throughout the last 10 years, who is called Helen Williams, who has been absolutely terrific in HMRC and been a great help for us introducing things. We will make no charge for doing this.
But what I was going to actually say to Mr. Harris is, I mean, when you look at the whole design of the scheme, a lot of the issues that we picked up, that it has a flurry of activity, and obviously it was a short-lived scheme. The danger of chancellors making statements at budgets about delivering things, it then sort of withered a bit, and obviously it's now ramping up again. But actually, is it the best place to be in HMRC when you've got these projects that start then stop? Is it better to have outside organisations commissioned to do the job well? Is that something you've learned from doing this? Or, what's your opinion on that?
So I think, first of all, I would echo that Helen's brilliant, and she works for Emily, by the way. Yes, I mean, I think here, what's required is a partnership. So, we've got responsibilities. The account providers in particular have got responsibilities, but we also, we fund the Share Foundation's contract to some extent with DFE. And I think, so I think there are a range of people who need to work together.
You had to be there at the beginning to set it up, because it was putting money into these accounts.
Yes. So, obviously our primary responsibility then was making sure everyone could open an account and administering the government payments into it. We've got a different responsibility now as the scheme matures. From our point of view,
do you think that it has to be in HMRC? Is really my point. It could be. It could be all. No. It could be something that's contracted out effectively.
From HMRC's point of view, we're delighted that there are lots of different ways that young people can find their accounts. That's great. That means that there are more opportunities for them to locate their account. We really support the Share Foundation's search engine, recognising that it has fewer providers than ours, but has really good data. So the more opportunities there are for young people, the better that is. We have a search tool that operates as well. It's the robot, which helps people to track down their accounts. We've improved that based on feedback over the course of the last few years. So actually your digital footprint now doesn't have to be as robust in order to access it and find your account. And we are doing further work to help young people where account providers have merged and changed their names so that they can work out, because you might get told your account's in one place.
Are you saying, and one, you seem to be keen to have that active role still, but are you saying that actually ultimately, because it was set up by HMRC, you're always going to have a backstop responsibility, even if you commissioned other people to help find it? Because we're hearing, on the NEOs saying that it can be other easier ways of finding it because your information is out of date by the time someone's 18.
Our database is comprehensive in that it covers all accounts. Yep. It is out of date in that where account providers have transferred their business or merged, we haven't kept that up to date. So what we are able to do is link any young person with the account as originally opened for them. For most of them, that will be all they need. For some of them, they need further assistance. And Share Foundation, whilst its database is less comprehensive, is actually more up to date than ours, and that's so that's a potential handoff, if you like. In terms of the formal way in which this scheme is administered for the rest of its life, I'm sure there are many options. The government has no plans, I think, to change the way it's done. But I think what needs to be done effectively is all the different parties working in partnership and using their different strengths together.
Well, I think we've got that loud and clear. Can I just keep with HMRC just for a minute, and I'll come back to you, Mr. Oldham. So on the evaluation point, it's been well made by my colleague, Ms. Mortimer, but I mean that. But we like evaluation on this committee, and we're very concerned at how little is done across government. So, Ms. Antcliffe, do you have any? What would trigger an evaluation of this scheme if there's no plans? Well, according to the minister, no plans immediately. What's it was keeping it under review? So, what would move it from keeping evaluation under review to actually evaluating this?
Well, ultimately, the decision to evaluate would be for ministers, and it would be their decision whether they wanted to evaluate the scheme. As far as I'm aware, at the moment, for a scheme that was started by a former government and ended in 2011, I don't think there is a particular appetite to do any further evaluation.
Okay, it's interesting you say that it's for ministers. I wouldn't say it's a massively political policy decision to look at a scheme. I mean, there are other examples of products, financial products that are created. We've got the lifetime ISA. We've had auto-enrolment, which is not quite, but similar things that are interventions into people's financial lives. And there must be lessons that are important to learn. But you're saying it's just never going to be. It's definitely not a decision for officials to take to say, well, what do we learn from this? What's gone well? What hasn't?
I would say there's two questions there. One is around the evaluation and whether or not we choose to go into the data and put resources into a formal evaluation, which I think would be a decision for ministers. From a policy point of view, absolutely, we make sure we learn lessons within HMRC. We think about kind of how we take those corporate lessons. We create playbooks which look at how we set schemes up, where things worked, where they didn't, what we can kind of hold on to from those. So a really good example is where we've created playbooks on the back of the COVID schemes and the job retention scheme to make sure that we understand HMRC's
But there's a big difference, isn't there,
role.
between a playbook, which is absolutely right, glad you're doing that, on how you do something, but then whether or not you should do it. If you're going to give advice to a future minister who might come in and say, well, actually, we want to do something, probably everyone would find a different title because ministers never call things like the old thing, but let's say someone wanted to do a similar thing again, you would have nothing to draw on except the playbook about how it was set up in the first place and a sort of general well, actually the NEA report is probably the best thing that there is out there, but there's not a detailed evaluation. So, well, maybe it's unfair to ask you, maybe it's Mr. Harra.
Well, I think it works two ways. I mean, so first of all, we do advise ministers of areas of the tax system where we think further research is required to enable us to effectively advise them, and that includes evaluating what's happening now, and also sort of what the options are. And ministers then say, yes, let's do that research, or no, I'm not interested in making policy in that area. We don't need to do that research. I think the other then, the sort of top down is, ministers might say to a department, we want you to carry out and publish an evaluation of this. And in this scheme, the reality is, I think, as Mr. Oldham has intimated, ministers, it was closed to new members a long time ago. There have been no further government contributions to it. Of course, they want to see it properly administered and closed down, but they have no plans to do that top down.
A lack of curiosity. I mean, if you look at social science budgets in Whitehall, often the valuation is underplayed. I mean, we've recently looked at the Department for Education, which put in, as the Permanent Secretary, what is a rounding error into evaluating programmes. The point there was that they get information on things that even if they don't continue, they will learn really detailed lessons for the design of future schemes. So at this point, this isn't a running off scheme, it's actually ramping up at this point. I think Mr. Oldham's made some good points about then what the impact is on young people's lives of that sort of investment. And we've got the LISA, which is a very, you could say it's a different cohort, but it's a similar putting money away for one day in the future. It might not be till retirement, that could be decades. So there might be lessons that could be learned, but you're just saying it's really not something that you would do or put to ministers as something to consider.
We certainly do put to ministers areas where we feel that research and evaluation would be valuable to us as policy makers to help them give best possible advice. But as I say, in relation to this scheme, the current policy is junior ISAs and lifetime ISAs, etc. There are no plans to do further evaluation, but I know that others, such as Bristol University, will carry out research.
But the common point in all of these schemes is that money or a treatment of money is being handed to a cohort, whatever age, whether LISAs are young but not children, and junior ISAs similarly, and the impact of what that money does and how people manage it That's the common thread, is it not? So there are new schemes being designed that have a thread, even if it's not exactly for that cohort, that runs through. I just don't worry about the lack of curiosity as you're designing new schemes. New ministers, well, let's face it, how many new ministers did, whether in the Treasury in the last year, new ministers come and go, but actually the consistency of evaluations surely must rest to a degree with officials in Whitehall. If it's just down to the whim of an individual minister, no minister's really worried about what's going to happen in 20 years. Well, hopefully some ministers are. Generally speaking, 20 years is a long horizon for a minister, but it's not for HMRC.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and I think we are talking about two different things. I mean, one is a sort of formal published evaluation of a policy, which is definitely a decision for ministers to take, but the other is gathering intelligence and recording that corporate learning so that we can give good policy advice. When a minister comes along and says, I would like to stimulate savings for children and young people, that we are able to advise about what has worked in the past and what hasn't.
How much do you spend on evaluation, typically?
I can get you that information. I don't
because we're just interested in it. We're going to be asking every department this. So
that's fine. Well, we certainly have a research budget, and I also have a big analytical team, so I'll get you that information.
And then one of the other issues about the financial literacy, again, which Ms Mortimer picked up on, that was one of the plans. So who's evaluating that bit of it? Because if we're trying to talk about financial literacy, which is still a current conversation, it's not a party political issue, are you looking at the impact of that, or are you relying on Mr Oldham and others to do that as well?
Within HMRC, there are definitely no plans to look at financial literacy and whether the scheme has an impact of that. Whether education policy.
Who is looking at evaluating that? Because that was very much a part of, as an adjunct to this at the time, but it's, as I say, been talked about many times since by governments of all colours.
I mean, in relation to specifically CTFs, no one has any plans. I mean, the responsibility for financial education in the curriculum, for example, sits with DFE in England.
Okay. Mr. Oldham,
can I just make one or two comments about this partnership thing? I very much appreciate the willingness to do a partnership with this, but it needs to be formalised, because at the moment, if we go to the Treasury ministers or we go to DFE and we say, please will you actually tell people about Find CDF and what we're doing, they say, oh, we've got the government gateway, and it's there, and so that's our system. Yes. It is a very blunt instrument, the government gateway. I mean, I know the NAO report refers to 235,000 inquiries into it. There's no idea how many of those are duplicates, what the age profile is of the people who've registered, what the success numbers are in terms of the numbers who've actually been linked at the end of this process. And in fact, the gateway itself, I know it was simplified a little bit about a couple of years ago, but it's still very, very challenging for a young person. The reason why we focus on the area that we do is at 16 years old, the young person is not only given a national insurance number, but they're also allowed to take control of their CTF account. They're not allowed to withdraw it until they're 18, but they can take control. That's why we start at 16. And we only cover for those young people up who are actually eligible and would have a child trust fund. So it's at 16 to 20 age group. We use TikTok, we use all sorts of social media to actually get the word across. And, it's therefore very relevant to those young people. Now, what we'd really like to do is to provide that as a focused facility for HMRC to use. I'm quite happy for it to be rebranded HMRC, if you prefer to call it that.
Okay. I think we're in danger of you pitching for business HMRC
I understand it.
I think the points are...
It's not a commercial pitch. This is
I think the points are well landing, and we know that where the intent is, and it's great.
Okay.
I just wanted to touch finally on the lessons learned for you at HMRC. Right, you're going to be... So let's say the minister today turns around and says, actually, we want to do something similar to this, or what lessons would you say have been learned from the design of this? First of all, to the outset, I think, like for instance, Ms Blake was raising this issue about capacity, complicated for you to deal with, but it's because it relies on other bits of government. So, what lessons have you learned, Mr. Harra?
So I feel, in terms of the sort of mechanical administration of the scheme, that we did a good job. We made sure that everyone got an account. We are now making sure that everyone can be reunited with their accounts. I think for me the key lesson is there's a set of quite complex policy objectives that it was intended to achieve. That can't be achieved just through the mechanical administration of the accounts. It needs a partnership of the different stakeholders in order to really deliver on those objectives. And I think back in 2005, I was focused on creating the IT system, which is why I think it worked very well. But I think a policy advisor needs to be able to give joined-up advice to a minister about how the whole network can work together.
Yeah. And also presumably from end to end, because the policy proposal at the time, I remember it intently being about getting that money to young people. There was a lot of talk about the money in the account, and the long-term stuff wasn't talked about so much.
Yeah, there was. I mean, obviously, at the start, the intent was that there would continue to be government contributions at different stages in the child's life, and that those would create opportunities, for example, in education, to say to 7-year-olds, "You've just had a payment of £250 into your account. What do you know what that means?" kind of thing. But of course, that all effectively got discontinued.
Yeah.
If I may say, one of the things which I think is an absolutely essential feature of the Child Trust Fund is that these are individual accounts in the individual young people's name. When the Westminster debate was fielded in 2019, Helen Goodman, who was the person who put it forward, didn't actually realise that they were individual accounts. She thought they were pooled accounts to begin with, or some sort of pool from which the government would draw. And that would make it very, very easy to push that towards dormancy. But these absolutely must not go dormant. They belong predominantly to low-income, disadvantaged young people, and we must find solutions to actually link up these accounts. And I think that's the thing that we've learned so much from this account. It's got a lot of merits to it, the CTF design. We have learnt a great deal. In my view, the long term is critical. The communication maintained with families, particularly revenue allocated accounts, is critical, and that it should be targeted and not universal. I think that's really important. It will also reduce the burden on government and make it more effective. Yep. But most of all, don't let them go dormant.
I think Mr. Oldham, we've got the message loud and clear, and you'd be a great advocate and advert for your organisation and the work that you're doing. So let's hope you can keep working together on this. And I think there's a lot of food for thought for us about how you evaluate these long-term programmes. And I think I pay tribute to the former member for Nottingham Central, who decided to set up a programme because he realised there was a high rate of teenage pregnancy in his constituency, and had set up a programme which is only just beginning to, and it's taken that long to see if those interventions have worked. So some of the best policy potentially is long term, and I think it's sometimes a bit of an onus on us as politicians to think longer term. But so some of it is down to us, I think. But can I thank you very much indeed for your time, for your candid and helpful evidence. The transcript of this session will be published on our website uncorrected in the next couple of days, and many thanks to our colleagues at Hansard for that. And we will be producing a report before the summer recess, and as you can sense, there's enthusiasm for these and for our constituents who will benefit from them on this committee, and we thank you for your enthusiasm for those young people too. Thank you very much. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended.